Okay, so I think we will get started now. My name is Meg Bacco, and I'm the Executive Director of Anacostia Trails Heritage Area. We work across Prince George's County in all things cultural tourism. We have been working and planning for over a year now for this super special semi-quincentennial year, 2026. And this is our one of our first events for sort of the all-encompassing America 250, the past 250 years of the United States of America. And we're trying to put sort of our approach is to be collaborative and inclusive. And we've really enjoyed getting to know a lot of our partners individually and agencies and organizations and volunteers and students. And the term that we're sort of using as sort of as the umbrella of how we're all working together is PGC 250. This is one of the first events sort of under that umbrella, and it's the first of our genealogy series. So this evening, we'll hear from Heather Olson, who is the Vice President and Program Chair of the Prince George's County Genealogical Society. They have been a partner since some of the first early planning meetings we had when we knew that this big anniversary year was coming up. So we're really grateful for their partnership and for helping kick us off. There are three more parts to this series, and they all relate to genealogy. The next one is going to be Wednesday, February 4th, related to finding family veterans with a focus on the Revolutionary War. And that's going to be led by Craig Scott, who is an expert genealogist, specifically with military records. Then we will be hearing from some of our partners at the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society of the Prince George's County chapter, and that's on February 19th, also 7 p.m. on Zoom. And then we're all going to try to get together in person for a tour of a lot of the in-person places and repositories and libraries and wonderful genealogical societies that you can visit as you continue on your genealogy journey. And that's going to take place Saturday, March 7th from 10 to 3 p.m. We're going to start at the Hyattsville Library, and that is a bus tour that we are able to provide at no cost because of some of the grant funding that we were able to receive. So thank you to everybody who is joining us tonight. Thank you to our partners and our sponsors. And I will from this point forward, I'll let sort of Heather take the reins of the meeting. And just one more housekeeping item. We won't have the chat open during Heather's presentation, so please take notes. Or questions that you have, keep track of them, scribble them down during the presentation, and we will take questions at the end and we'll help sort of facilitate that. And in the chat, however, if you didn't already receive the sort of worksheet resource page that Heather provided in email, my colleague Valerie just put that in the chat. So you can also use that to follow along on Google Drive. So with that, thank you again for being here. And Heather, feel free to start your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody. First off, can everyone see the slide on the screen okay? Okay, great. I am going to actually turn off my video because I sometimes have issues with bandwidth, so I think it's probably better if I do that, and that way you can focus on the presentation rather than on my picture. Just a couple of basic points. This presentation is geared to those who have no prior experience with researching their families. If you've already been researching your family for a while, much of it will be familiar, but hopefully you'll still pick up some new ideas and useful hints. Second, I'm not focusing specifically on Prince George's County. I know people move to this area from all over the place, and so I'm trying to provide something that would be useful to you regardless of where your family came from or what their circumstances were. First of all, start with what you already know. Unless you were adopted, you probably know when and where you were born and who your parents were. If you're married, you know your spouse's name and when and where you were married. If your parents have passed, you probably know when and where they died. Moving backwards, there will be things you know, but other things you don't. You may remember that your grandmother's birthday was May 12, but not know what year she was born. You may remember where your grandparents lived when you were a child, but not be sure how long they had lived there. Next, look for sources in your home or the homes of family members. That could be copies of birth, marriage, or death certificates. That could be a marriage announcement or invitation, the program from a funeral, or a baby book. Newspaper clippings can be really great sources. That could include an obituary, a birth or marriage announcement, or perhaps the announcement of a promotion or a retirement. There might also be a newspaper clipping about something important that a family member did. This particular article was about my father, who was a volunteer firefighter, rescuing a teenager from a mine shaft. You might find a card congratulating new parents on a baby or offering sympathy when a loved one died. Remember, if someone sent a card or a note after such an event, that tells you that person who sent the note or card was alive to send it. So you know they died after the birth or death in question. A book provided by a funeral home may identify those who attended a funeral. Some will be friends or work colleagues, others will be family. If you recognize the name of a relative, you know they died after the funeral in question. Family Bibles can be a tremendous resource. Some will have family information written on pre-printed forms found between the Old and New Testament. Others will have the information written inside the front or back cover. Some will have information about one couple and their children, while others may have information about a number of generations of a family. Letters may mention family members by name, clarify relationships, or announce a birth or death. This one helpfully provides the address of the bereaved mother so that the letter's recipient can send condolences. A simple postcard like this one may point to a relative's military service. Photographs can be a great resource, especially if there's a date. But remember that a date printed on the front or back will be when the film was developed, not necessarily when the picture was taken. A handwritten date, like this one, will refer to when the picture was taken, but it could have been written down years after the picture was taken, so you can't be 100% sure it's accurate. A picture showing someone in uniform, it could be a useful clue that that person served. Don't ignore the backs of photographs. This seemingly unimportant picture of a house included on the back a notation that it was where Marion was born, and it includes a date and an address. Marion was my great-grandmother, so that was a very important clue about her birth date and exactly where she was born. As you start gathering information, you will probably find it useful to use some type of chart to organize your information. There are programs you can download to your computer or use in the cloud that will do this, both free and not free. But if you're just getting started, the simplest solution may be to print out a couple of basic forms, a pedigree chart and a family group sheet. A pedigree chart is a simple one-page chart with space for information on one person and 3 to 5 generations of their ancestors. Once you get beyond the last generation on the first chart, you put a number referring to the next chart. Say I put a 2 up here to indicate that that's where the next chart starts. And then you start a new chart with that person as the first person. So they go back over here, and then you go on with their ancestors. The other chart is what's called a family group sheet, and this has room for information about one couple and their children. And it helps keep track of everyone in a given family, not just your direct ancestors. So if you were doing it about your grandparents, for example, you'd include not only the relevant parent, but all the aunts and uncles as well, and who they married. I've included a link in your handout to some charts that you can download and print out. Whether you choose to use a computer or a program or paper to record your information, you should get in the habit early of recording where you found out individual pieces of information. For example, you might note that you got Grandpa Smith's date of death from his funeral program. It may not seem important now, but if you later find conflicting information, you'll go nuts if you haven't written down where you found that original date, and you won't know how to evaluate those conflicting pieces of information to decide which is most likely to be correct. Next, you want to talk to your family members and collect oral history and oral tradition. It's important to understand the difference between the two. Oral history is the collection and study of historical information about individuals, families, or historical events using audio or video recordings or transcriptions of interviews with people who have personal knowledge of past events. Oral tradition, sometimes called family tradition, on the other hand, involves stories that have been handed down in families at least once and sometimes many times. The key distinction is personal knowledge. If, for example, you interview your father about his experience serving in World War II, that is oral history. You are talking to him about something he personally witnessed or took part in, which means all other things being equal, it is more likely to be accurate. He is what historians call a primary source. It's still possible he will remember wrong, especially if he is elderly. It is possible he will exaggerate his exploits or leave out an episode that is particularly painful or one that he's not so proud of. You will still want to compare what he tells you with any military records you have access to, with what his buddies who served with him say about the same episodes, and what historians of the engagement he was involved in say. But in most cases, what he tells you will be fairly accurate. If you interview your father about his father's experience serving in World War I, that is family tradition. Your father may have heard his father talk about World War I all his life, but your father isn't talking about something he witnessed or experienced himself. He is what historians call a secondary source. There is still a good likelihood that what you will be told will be accurate, but now you not only have to worry about the memory and truthfulness of the original source, your soldier grandfather, you have to worry about the memory and truthfulness of your father, who is repeating the story, and the possibility that he may have misunderstood something his father told him. If you were interviewing a family member about a more distant ancestor's experience in the Civil War, you have to exercise still more caution because the story may have been handed down multiple times. Some of you may remember a game many of us played as children called telephone. One child would whisper a short phrase to the child next to them, who would then whisper it to the child next to them, and so on. Often, by the time the short phrase had passed between 10 or 15 children, it had changed somewhere along the way because someone had misheard. That same principle comes into play with family tradition. The farther you are from the original source, and the more times the story has been repeated, the more room there is for something to be misunderstood or misremembered along the way. That doesn't mean a very old family story is wrong. It just means you need to treat it with caution. And I would say if you're dealing with stories that may have involved immigrant ancestors, you have to be particularly cautious because there may have been a language barrier involved. There are some stories that my mother told me that she heard from her immigrant great grandparents, and they didn't speak English very well. So I have to wonder if what they were telling her kind of got lost in translation. Oftentimes, when you are interviewing a family member, what you are doing will be a mixture of oral history and oral tradition. That is, you'll be asking them both about things that happened in their own lives and about things they have been told about their family. That's okay, but it's important to keep the distinction between them clear in your own mind. If at all possible, it's a good idea to tape the interview with your relative. Sometimes it won't be possible, and if that is the case, take very careful and detailed notes. Note the time, location, name of interviewer, name of interviewee, and note any other persons who are present. This last is important because sometimes other people who are present will remember things too or ask questions, and it's important to keep straight who said what. I once was interviewing my father's cousin, and my dad was present, and dad started remembering stories that the cousin actually didn't remember. And when dad wrote down his notes about the discussion, he thought that some things he remembered were things his cousin remembered, and I had to correct him and say, no, that was what you remembered, not what your cousin Ed remembered. Provide the interviewee with a copy of the transcript or notes and ask if there is anything they want to add or change. Avoid asking leading questions or putting words in the interviewee's mouth. You can and should ask questions to clarify, but try to let them describe things in their own words. People may have difficulty remembering dates when things happened. It may help to try to connect events they are describing with events in their own lives. Thus, a person who is at a loss to remember what year their grandmother died may be able to tell you it was while they were in elementary school, right after they were married, or soon after their family moved. If your interviewee is describing things for which they are not a primary source, things that they heard about from others, try to determine who they heard about it from and whether their source was a primary source. Next, I'm going to talk about the U.S. federal census. If your family was in the U.S. by 1950, this is really the best place to start because, first of all, it's easy to access online. There are multiple free and commercial databases that offer you access. Second, since it's a federal record, it's going to be the same regardless of where in the country your family lived. Since it was taken every 10 years and people are grouped in households, it's a fairly easy way to find children with their parents. For privacy reasons, the US federal census is closed for 72 years. So the most recent census that is currently available is the 1950 census. The 1960 census will become available in 2032. The first census was taken in 1790, and the 1890 census was lost in a fire, but the others have mostly survived. Your handout includes a chart with a summary of the information that was included in different years, but broadly speaking, there was much less information in the early censuses and much more once you get into the 20th century. As I mentioned, there are multiple databases that you can use to access the census. The one I'm going to demonstrate tonight is called Heritage Quest. It is a commercial database, but if you have a Prince George's County Library card or a card from most other public libraries, pretty much any public library in Maryland and most in other states, you can access it from home wherever you are. You can either go to the library webpage, come up to online library and click there, then come over to online resources and click there, then scroll down to Heritage Quest and click on that. Or you can use the link I provided in your handout, which takes you directly to what you see on the screen right now. You're then asked to enter your library card number, and you type it in and click Connect. Then you want to scroll down until you come to Search the Census. Click Search Now, and then you want to look for 1950 census, which is what we're going to start with. And I am going to look for a man named Arndt Hasted, who was living somewhere in New York. And I deliberately chose someone with a fairly uncommon name for this first attempt, because if we tried to look for Mary Smith, we'd have to sort through a lot of Mary Smiths to find the right person. So by putting in Arndt's name, I then click search, and I get search results which show there was only one Arndt Hasted. And he was in fact living in New York State in Richmond County, otherwise known as Staten Island. We have an estimate of his birth year here of about 1885, and we find that there were two people in the household, at least two people in the household with him, relatives Gerda and Arnold. If I click on View Record, it brings up the actual census record. If you look in the top left corner, it shows the state, then the county, and then if there is a locality involved, like city or town, that will also be shown. But in this case, because it's Richmond County, which is Staten Island, there isn't really a municipality involved. Then over here, which unfortunately is a little bit hard to see because it's off the screen, is the street address. Then we have the name of the head of household, which is Arndt M. Hasted. He's a white male, 65 years old, married, born in Norway, and he's working as a carpenter. With him is his wife, Gerda. She is 63, also born in Norway, and a son, Arnold, who was never married. He was born in New York, and he's 36 years old, and he's working as a lighter captain. Now, the 1950 census, unlike some earlier censuses, does not tell us when an immigrant immigrated to the US, but we can kind of infer from the fact that Arnold was born in New York 36 years before the 1950 census, that is about 1914, that probably Arndt and Gerda came to the US before that date. Now, going back to the census year selection screen, I could go and pick the 1940 census and look for Arndt in the 1940 census as well, or the 1930 census, but we don't have all night, and I want to talk about some other types of records. So instead, I am going to skip back to the 1920 census, and I'm also going to skip the process of doing the search. So you're just going to see the 1920 census come up as though we had done the search. And I've also broken the census page up into two parts. That's because the 1920 census schedule was very wide. And if I had shown you the whole thing side by side, you would not have been able to read it because it would have been a little too fine a print. So I've broken it up into two pieces so you can see it. And you see up here, we have Arndt Hasted again. He's the head of household. And if you come over here, you see we have some new information that wasn't in the 1950 census. It shows his year of immigration is 1902, and it shows that he is naturalized and that he was naturalized in 1913. His age is 35, which conveniently is 30 years younger than his age in 1950. So that part all adds up. Another thing that is different in 1920 from 1950 is it includes the place of birth not only for the person listed in the census, but their parents. So we see that Arndt was born in Norway, But then we also see that his parents were also born in Norway. And there's another thing that's included, which is something called the mother tongue. What that basically means is the language that you spoke as a young child. Now, you're not going to be surprised to learn that Arndt and Gerda, who were born in Norway, their mother tongue was Norwegian. But suppose you were looking for someone who was born in Germany. It might be very helpful to learn that actually the language they spoke was Polish. Or if they were born in Russia, it would be helpful to know that their mother tongue was Yiddish. Or if they were born in Turkey, it would be helpful to know that they spoke Greek or Arabic. Turning now to the wife Gerda, we see that she arrived in the US in 1888, so she would have been a very young child and likely came with her parents. Arndt, on the other hand, was a teenager when he arrived in 1902, so perhaps he came with parents, perhaps he came on his own, we don't know. We should also note that in addition to the son Arnold, there's also a daughter, Juliet, who is living in the household with them. And she was not with them in 1950, so she had moved out, married, or perhaps died by that time. And she was 8 years old in 1920, so born approximately 1912. So that probably tells us that likely Arndt and Gerda were married before 1912, but we're not really sure if they would have been married by 1910, when the 1910 census was taken, or not. So I'm going to do a search now in the 1910 census Arndt, and I find him single and living as a boarder in the household of a man named Jacob Olson and his wife Augusta. Like Arndt and Gerda, Jacob and Augusta were born in Norway. We also see that both Arndt and Jacob were sailors. If you see someone listed as a boarder in the census, don't assume that that's the only relationship they have with the people they're living with. Arndt may have been related to the couple he was living with. He might have come from the same village in Norway, or he might have served on the same ship as Jacob, since they both had the same occupation. As genealogists, we want to get in the habit of keeping track of people who are connected in some way with our ancestors, whether as friends, neighbors, or co-workers, as those connections can often be helpful to us in researching our ancestors. And also, these people do sometimes turn out to be related, either somewhat distantly or very distantly. If we look at the entry below Arndt, we see that it is for a woman called Gerda Gutterson, who is also a boarder in the household, and she's 23 years old and born in Norway. Now, if you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed that that looks suspiciously like what we know about the woman who was later to become Arndt's wife. She also would have been 23 because she was 33 in 1920. And she has the same first name and the same birthplace. So I'm kind of wondering if that might be, in fact, Arndt's future wife. We can't know for sure, but we should note down this is a hunch or a possibility that deserves further investigation. There's some additional information in the 1910 census that we can learn about Jacob and Augusta, the couple Arndt is living with. The 1910 census asks the number of years a married couple had been married. So up here, we see, where's my cursor? There it is. We see that that Jacob and Augusta had been married 12 years. So subtract 12 from 1910, and that's somewhere around 1898. We're also told that Augusta was the mother of 6 children, 4 of whom were still living. If we count the children who were with her in the census, there's 3 daughters and a son. So that's 4 kids still living who are with them in the household, but there were 2 others who had died, something that was sadly common in those days. But if we want to know more about that family, we'd want to look for those two missing kids to find out when they were born and when they died. As I said, I used Arndt as an example because there was only ever one man named Arndt Hasted living in the US, so he was easy to find. But if you're looking for someone with a very common name like Mary Smith, unfortunately, it'll be a little more challenging. But there's some things you can do. If we go back to the 1950 census search screen, we see there are options to enter information like a birthplace or a year of birth. We can also enter an exact place where the family was living. And you can enter the names of other people who were living in the household at the same time, so it's like a father, mother, sibling, or spouse. And that will narrow down the possibilities, so you'll only get results that match those criteria. If you scroll this screen down, there are some other options to enter things like occupation, race, or marital status. The more information you enter, the fewer results you'll get. So you'll have fewer census entries that you have to look at to see if you have the right one. But obviously with a common name like Mary Smith, you're still going to get a lot of hits, and you're going to have to kind of sift through them and see which is the right one. Now let's talk about civil vital records. That is, records of birth, marriage, or death kept by a state or local government. These records can be very helpful since, unlike census records, they tell you exactly when and where an event took place, and they have lots of helpful information. The challenge is that different states started keeping records at different times, have different procedures for getting copies, and different privacy restrictions on recent records. If records were kept at the local level, procedures may even be different from one city to another in the same state. In some cases, you may be able to get records online for free. In other cases, you may have to write to a state government agency, pay a large fee, and wait a long time. It really just depends. Since I'm assuming those of you listening will be researching in a number of different states, I'm not going to try to spell out what the procedures are for all the different states. Instead, I've included in your handout a link to a wiki that's got information about different states. And let me add, if you're researching outside the US, there will likely be similar records, and there should be a link in the wiki that takes you to global options for civil vital records as well. In general, a modern birth record is going to include the name of the child, the names of the parents, their address or addresses, either their dates of birth or ages, their birthplaces, their occupations, and the name of the doctor or midwife. Sometimes you'll also have information about previous children born to the same couple. A modern marriage record will typically include the names of both parties, either their dates of birth or their ages, their addresses, their occupations, the names of their parents, and whether they were previously married and how the previous marriage ended, if that's the case, and the name of the person who performed the ceremony. Now, if the person who performed that ceremony is a clergyman, you want to make note of that because that can point to a particular religious congregation the couple, or at least one of them, belong to, and you may find additional records on them and other members of their family by accessing the church records. A modern death record typically includes the person who has died, their marital status, their age or their date of birth, place of death, the cause of death, the doctor who was taking care of them, their occupation, their place of birth, and then the names of their parents and their parents' place of birth, as well as information on where they're being buried or cremated and when. I'm going to caution you, though, that things like the parents' names and birthplaces, and even the date of birth and place of birth for the person who died would be provided by a family member typically. Usually that person is identified as an informant. And the information that's provided is only going to be as good as the information of that person. So if the informant was the deceased's grandson, say, the grandson might really not have ever known his great grandparents or know anything about them, and he might get it wrong. So you have to kind of keep in mind that that information it's a secondary source information. Death certificates are a primary source for things like the name of the deceased, the date of death, the place of death, the cause of death, at least to the extent that in past times doctors understood the causes of death. But things like, his father's place of birth, that's just the best guess that somebody had. And also, you have to keep in mind that the people who were the informants, the family members providing that information, were under stress because they just lost a loved one. And, sometimes they just got a little confused. So even people who knew the right answer didn't always provide the right answer at that precise moment. As I mentioned, sometimes civil vital records are available online. One example is New York City, which has its own online database. Remember our friend Arndt? I'm going to try searching for his marriage record. I click on search, and sure enough, I was kind of right to suspect that Gerda Gutterson, who was also a fellow boarder in the house of Jacob Olson in 1910, was in fact Arndt's future wife. As you see, they were both living at that same address where they were in the census. And the marriage record provides their places of birth in Norway and their parents' names. Now, if you're going to try and look for records of an immigrant in the country he or she came from, that is some really crucial information to find, because in most countries, records you're going to find on your immigrant ancestor are going to be organized locally. And so if you don't know where they came from, it's hard. But having that kind of information on a marriage certificate or a death certificate can help you find those records in the country they came from. Also note that Jacob Olson, the man who they were living with, is one of the witnesses to the wedding. So that's sort of another indication that these people had a relationship beyond the fact that they were just living there. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is newspapers. At the beginning, I mentioned the possibility of finding something you or a family member had clipped from a newspaper, but you can also go out and find historic newspapers you don't already have. There are two ways to do this. If you have a date and place for an event, you can access a microfilm or electronic copy of the relevant newspaper and look through it to see if what you want is there. For example, I knew my great-grandmother was killed when a train hit her car, and I knew the date, and we all know the old saying that if it bleeds, it leads. So I figured there would be newspaper coverage, and sure enough, there was. Alternately, you can use a searchable database and put in keywords such as an ancestor's name, the town where he or she lived, or anything else that might help you find what you're looking for. For example, if I didn't know the date, I might use my great-grandmother's name, the town where she lived, and then words like train and accident as keywords to try to find the story. The Library of Congress and the University of Maryland's McKeldin Library both have large collections of newspapers from around the country on microfilm. McKeldin also has a number of electronic databases of newspapers, including those focused on, for example, early American newspapers, African American newspapers, Confederate newspapers, abolitionist newspapers, and newspapers from World War II prison camps for Japanese Americans. For those researching outside the US, there are databases of Latin American newspapers, British newspapers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. To access these databases, you would need to go to the library, which is open to the public, and you would need to request a visitor's pass in order to use their computers, but it's a simple process. You just go to the desk and give them your ID, and they will let you use them. The library is open to the public as well as students. But if you don't want to leave home, the Library of Congress has a free newspaper database that you can access from anywhere called Chronicling America. The link to it is in your handout, and it's a searchable database with a large collection of different newspapers. Another database of newspapers is the Google Newspaper Archive. That's also in the link to that is also in your handout, and it's also free. And that is actually a global database. So if you're researching outside the US, there's a number of newspapers from other parts of the world that you can use in your research. Another source is newspapers.com. This is a subscription site, and it's targeted specifically at genealogists, where those other two are targeted at a broader audience that includes people who are interested in, for example, more general history. If you don't want to pay to subscribe, they do offer a free trial, and it's also available at some genealogical libraries. Obviously, the first thing most of us will look for in a newspaper is notices of the death, birth, or marriage of our ancestor. While today those major life events may be all you will find in a newspaper about ordinary people, in the past, small town newspapers often had information about things we wouldn't think newsworthy. For example, people who were taking trips or entertaining guests. If someone was ill, that would be reported, especially if it was a serious illness. Or if someone was celebrating a birthday. I hope I don't need to tell you that you take 84 and subtract it from whatever year that newspaper article occurred, and you're going to find out when this lady was born. Likewise, the celebration of an anniversary here, subtract 55 from the date of that newspaper, and you've got an idea of when this couple was married. There's another important tidbit in this particular article, because it mentions that Mr. and Mrs. Lockhart are among the valued members of the First Presbyterian Church, Mr. Lockhart being a member of the Board of Trustees for a good many years. Okay, that tells you that the records of that church, if you can find them, are going to be a useful resource, because you're going to find out about not only births, baptisms, marriages, burials for this family in the records of that church, but perhaps Mr. Lockhart's service as a trustee. Often there was a requirement to place a legal notice in the newspaper if an estate was being probated, or a business was closed, or if a partnership was being broken up and one of the partners was continuing the business alone, as the case of these two notices here. That was so creditors would know to come forward, but obviously that provides information that might be useful if these people are your ancestors. Immigrant communities were often served by a native language newspaper. These might report news from the old country as well as local news. If you're researching in a time and place before vital records were kept, or those records are difficult or expensive to get copies of, records from a church, synagogue, or other religious congregation may be a good substitute. Sometimes they may even contain more information than vital records. The challenge can be identifying the congregation your ancestor belonged to and accessing the records. For more recent ancestors, a family member may know which congregation specific ancestors belong to. You may find a reference in an obituary or other newspaper article, as was the case in the article I showed you a few minutes ago about an anniversary celebration. The name of the clergyman who performed a marriage on a marriage certificate may also be a clue. If you've identified a congregation and it still exists, try contacting them and asking if they still have their old records or they've been transferred to an archive. Most will allow genealogists to look at their records when the office is open, and some will do lookups. If someone spends time helping you, it's nice to show your thanks by making a donation. If the congregation no longer exists, a local historical or genealogical society in the area where the congregation was based may know what happened to their records. Some church records have been digitized and are available online. The best place to look for them is familysearch.org, which is a free site, and the link to that is also in your handout. You want to click on search, and then from the drop down menu, you want to click on catalog. Then you're going to type in the name of the place you're interested in. So wherever that religious congregation was. I chose to enter Prince George's County, but if you're researching in a particular city or a town within a county, you might want to enter that. The location will pop up, and you then click on that location, and you then will search through a number of different types of records until you come to church records. It's alphabetical. And in this particular case, there are 12 sets of religious records, but in some instances you may have, so like if you're researching in a large place like Philadelphia, there are literally hundreds of them. If you're researching in a smaller place, there may be only one or two or even none at all. So I choose to click on the records for St. John's Parish Episcopal, and I sort through these, and this is not indexed. You're having to kind of go through and look for the particular record for the particular year that you're interested in. And if I were interested in a child that was baptized in 1840, we have the date of birth, we have the parents' names, we have the date of baptism, and the name of the child. So if I was not able to get a vital record for that early date, this would be a good substitute. In addition to Family Search, you may find some church records on Ancestry. That's a subscription site that is available for free in Prince George's County libraries. Unfortunately, you do have to actually go to the library in person, unlike Heritage Quest, which you can access from home with your library card number. There's a bunch of other types of records that may be helpful in your research. These are just some of them. I wish I had time to talk to you about all these different types of records, but of course, we only have a short time tonight, so I will limit myself to just saying a few words about each. Probate records are often the best way to connect parents to children in that early period before we have access to either to vital records, and sometimes when even church records are not available either because they were never created or because they've long since disappeared. Probate records can also be very helpful in tracing the enslaved. City directories can be very useful for urban research. For those who aren't familiar with city directories, they're kind of the precursors to phone books. I feel like if I give this talk in a few years, I'll have to explain what phone books were, but hopefully we're not quite there yet. They basically listed mostly the heads of household and sometimes other members of the household who were employed in any given city with their address and their occupation. They can be very helpful in finding out when people moved, and obviously identifying their specific address. In rural areas, tax records can be very helpful for pinning down when someone died or moved and when they came of age, because generally, at a particular age, you had to start paying taxes. That age differed from place to place, but often it was 21. Immigration records can help pin down exactly when an immigrant arrived in the U.S. and will also show the group of people who immigrated together, and that may be helpful if by the time of the next census they were not all together. Obviously, sometimes you also find out where exactly they were coming from. Military records, and in particular military pension records, can be enormously helpful. I'm not going to talk about this much because Craig's going to be talking about this, but if you have an ancestor who served in the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, you absolutely want to find out if there was a pension, because these people basically told their life stories in the course of applying for a pension. A widow's pension from the Civil War is a particularly useful record because, there were just scads of government forms that she had to fill out, and she had to prove she'd married the soldier and, provide documentation and witness statements about pretty much every aspect of her life, which, as you can imagine, is a gold mine. Land records may tell you when an ancestor moved, and in the case of inherited land, may clarify relationships. One other thing you're likely to come across as you're researching is families compiled by other researchers. That might be research done by your great aunt many years ago, or something you find on the internet. These can be useful clues, but you need to find the actual records other researchers used and analyze them and see if you agree with their conclusions. Unfortunately, just because someone posted a family tree online and attached a bunch of source documents to it, that doesn't mean their conclusions will be correct. Even when you've done the research yourself, you need to be open to revising your conclusions. If you find new evidence or something turns out to be wrong. Let me give you an example. I found my great-great-great-grandparents in the 1850 census. In the 1860 census, I found my great-great-great-grandfather living with his daughter and son-in-law, and no sign of his wife. I concluded she probably died between 1850 and 1860. Then, much later, I found a death record from after 1860 that I think must be her. I don't know whether she was also living with her daughter and son-in-law in 1860 and the census taker just screwed up and failed to include her, or if she was living somewhere else and for some reason wasn't included in the census, or she was listed under a different name and I don't recognize her. I'm still trying to work that out. But the point is, you have to be open to the possibility that your original conclusion might not be accurate, and constantly go back and revisit your conclusions and reevaluate and rethink. So, some next steps. Attend the other lectures in this series, which Meg mentioned. Join a historical or genealogical society. That could be a local society whose meetings you can attend in person, or it could be a society based in the area where your ancestors lived, since those folks are going to have the most knowledge about the area you're researching. Talk to your older family members. Once they're gone, it's too late. Start doing research. Even if you don't have a lot of time, spend a little bit of time on it. Find at least a few things. And don't be afraid to ask more experienced researchers for advice. We love helping others. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was fantastic. so many resources, very well paced so that we could keep track and write things down. I believe my colleague Valerie has just put the worksheet that you mentioned a couple times in the chat again. And I think now everybody should have the function where we can make it so that folks can either put questions in the chat or can unmute themselves and ask questions, either about specific things that Heather mentioned, examples, or share a little bit about where you all might be in your process. I think at this point, we're also going to stop the recording so that if you do have questions, you can feel free to ask them. They won't be recorded if we post this video on YouTube or share it with other folks who weren't able to join us. So I think we're take care of that.